A few months ago, I discovered a project called EUOS. It seemed interesting, so I added it to the list of our video ideas and just quickly forgot about it. A month later, it somehow reached every news and YouTube homepage, and yet I believe that most of them completely missed the point, so let's discuss that. EUOS is a proof-of-concept operating system based on Fedora and built by developer Robert Riemann, if that's how you pronounce it, head of the digital transformation sector in the technology and privacy unit at the European Data Protection Supervisor. To be clear, EUOS is the free-time project of Robert, and it's not embraced by any EU institution in any way. Currently, it's a one-man project, though it's a quite skilled one-man. The end goal is to transition the public European infrastructure towards open source Linux operating system. This brings some extra deployment requirements which EUOS has to address, such as the ability to provide an easy way to adapt to different regions and sectors, and ease of management for system administrators on large scales. As such, EUOS is described as not meant for home users, but for system administrators who want to deploy automatically Linux to many corporate computers or laptops. EUOS wants to propose a common Linux OS based on bootable container technology and a common method to manage users and their data. So let's immediately place EUOS within a larger context. The broader initiative is Public Money, Public Code, which aims to make all software created through taxpayers' money as released as free software, and more generally to push for the usage of open source within public institutions. There have been a few local successes of this initiative. The most notable example was the city of Munich, which had migrated more than 80% of all of its desktops to a Linux derivative called Linux. However, the move has been reverted in 2017 and the city has returned to using Microsoft Windows. Nonetheless, Linux has been the first Linux desktop certified for industry use by the German Technical Inspection Association and had managed to save more than 10 million euros. On an international level, we have three examples. Astra Linux, widely deployed in the Russian Federation, Kylin and Neo Kylin with a 90% market share in the Chinese government sector, and Nova Linux, used in the Cuban public sector. You might notice some connection between the three, though we will get back to it later on. Nonetheless, Robert points out that these examples leave no doubt of the feasibility of large-scale Linux deployment in the public sector. It is only a matter of political support, priority, and funding. So, why isn't there political support for this in the European Union? Especially considering the clear benefits that the migration would bring. We're talking about tax savings, since you wouldn't have to pay for commercial licenses. You'd also avoid software suppliers and vendors lock-in. With Windows, you're entirely in Microsoft hands regarding support of certain operating systems, and even worse, the type of hardware that you need to run the supported versions of Windows. And of course, open standards foster innovation, they take fewer IT administration resources, and benefit from the worldwide free software community. Is all of this what brought China and Russia to ditch Windows in favor of Linux? If I had to bet, there's probably some other reason that is better explained through our favorite subject, politics. Of course, China and Russia and the US are not what I would call friendly allies. Thus, this country probably started internal efforts to make their government sections independent from closed source US-based software, such as Windows. By pivoting to Linux, they're able to check for backdoors in the operating system and develop their own flavors, which they control entirely. On the other hand, the EU has been considered an ally to the US for years now. However, thanks to the latest great US administration, this statement is beginning to be a bit more doubtful. Thus, the timing of this EUOS initiative is most likely not random. Indeed, I also agree that the current political climate makes the usage of locked down proprietary software from the US somewhat risky, and it might be time to consider sovereign options. However, a lot of discussion has been raised on exactly what we should mean by sovereign options. Many, such as Brody Robertson, go watch his videos, have criticized EUOS for their usage of Fedora, which is an international project but has ties with the US company Red Hat. The registrar even decides to call Fedora an American distro, which is not something I would say ever. Again, Fedora is not developed by or in any specific country, and the team is international. It is, however, true that many core, code, legal, and so on contributors are Red Hat employees. However, applying this sort of thinking gets complex quickly. As an example, Brody also mentions that EUOS, I can pronounce this, EUOS uses KDE Plasma Desktop, and he says that he is fine with that since the KDE EV is based in Germany. And thus, he says, it's fair to say that KDE is German. So first of all, no, it's not fair to say that. KDE is an international project that's not developed by or in any specific country. The KDE EV non-profit is, yes, German, but it's a different entity compared to KDE, and products such as Plasma are not products made by the KDE EV, they are made by KDE. This might seem stupid to say, but it's relevant both legally, as in KDE products are not legally developed in Germany, and practically, as in the most common country of origin of KDE developers is not Germany. And if you want to go further, I want to point out that many core KDE contributors, such as myself, if I can call myself a core KDE contributor, are employed by Tech Paladin, which is a US company yet again. Even worse, the primary owner of Tech Paladin, Nick Graham, is also on the board of the KDE EV. Thus, by the same logic as Fedora, KDE also has direct and strong ties with an American company. Brody should be well aware of that since, well, he has just interviewed Nate. I haven't watched the video yet, but I'm really sorry. I'm gonna do that very soon. And we could go on. Sure, Linux is an international project, but it has direct ties and gets funding from the Linux Foundation, which is US-based. Mozilla Firefox is developed by a for-profit American company. Even OS components like Pipewire have direct ties to, again, Red Hat. Thus, if our criteria for sovereign software does not have direct ties with US companies, then I don't know, let's just give up. There's nothing we can do there. However, I believe that that is a flawed logic. Let's instead talk more practically. The issue with using American software is security, as in they might contain government backdoors, and independence, as in future decisions by American companies might have a direct negative impact on EU institutions that are using their software. These are the main risks that we want to mitigate. Evidently, by using free and open source software, we're safe on the security part of this. Since development happens publicly, the US government cannot go to Red Hat and kindly ask them to add a backdoor in. They wouldn't be able to do it. Or at least it would be orders of magnitude more complex compared to Windows, since you would have to do it in public, thus fooling the entire world. Let's talk independence. Free and open source software also provides a good layer of protection here. If Red Hat decides to try to kill Fedora tomorrow, they wouldn't be able to. The project would get forked, if necessary, probably not even that. But even if, the existing community would continue development, though certainly at a slower pace. If necessary, the EU could also create its own forks of the software it relies on and fund their development. This means that open source software here provides an exit strategy in case something goes wrong, which is all we need, really. I think that the strength of my arguments here is proven by the fact that both Astra Linux and Kylin, I don't know, are entirely based on Linux distributions and free and open source software that's developed around the world, US included. They have strong reasons to want independence, and yet they're fine with using free and open source software even when it has ties to other countries. Robert I think also agrees with me because he's smart. He says EUOS. My screen went to sleep. This is not something I want. I was saying, Robert also agrees with me because he's smart. He says EUOS shall not confound sovereignty and protectionism. There is no problem per se in relying on international free and open source components, and oftentimes it is in practice unavoidable. However, EUOS promotes to maintain strict control on business data and telemetry data. This includes the free choice where to store such data, on-premise or cloud of choice, and furthermore, the availability of know-how for a given free and open source component within the EU shall be considered. Also, I feel like we're getting sidetracked on this sovereignty part of the discussion, whereas the point of EUOS was to be a proof of concept that you can deploy Linux desktops at a large scale within the EU public sector, which is a different thing entirely. That said, do allow me to briefly make fun of a couple of news articles about this. I've already criticized the registrar's American distro, but I believe that the Linux journal also seriously missed the point by publishing EUOS, a bold step towards digital sovereignty for Europe. A bold step. Are we really calling an unofficial one-man project a bold step towards digital sovereignty for the entire EU? I mean, it would be a bold step if the EU embraced the project, but they didn't so far. The article by EUOS is good, but I love the very first comment. There won't be privacy and such if an American corporate is behind it. In America, you are forced to let the government have access to your software security or you go under. Which is not only straight up false, but also misses the point entirely that Red Hat doesn't own Fedora, nor realistically can they hide backdoors in it. Let's move on though. The EUOS project has gained the attention of OpenSUSE too. They recently released an article offering some criticism of the project. They say the current Fedora plus KDE direction is mature, but relying on one distro and one desktop environment introduces avoidable risks. Instead, it would be wise for all governments to embrace alternatives like Ion with GNOME alongside another immutable Plasma-based choice of Kalpa. Why? Security. Different distributions and desktops reduce the risk of a single point of failure. If vulnerabilities emerge, they won't simultaneously impact every system. This is an understandable position. By only offering one distribution and one desktop, you are more exposed to events related to those projects specifically. However, I believe that the EUOS project mostly picked Fedora and KDE as sort of placeholders, as the real proof of concept is about the deployment of the system. Fedora has a reasoning behind it, but too technical. I do want to bring forward one criticism of my own though, and I accept that I might be wrong. Are we sure that we're not just talking about a name here? If we go check the project itself, the only repository is almost devoid of any code, and almost all of the folders that I'm currently showing on the screen are empty. If we go ahead and see future planned tasks, we have things like document use cases for EUOS, document requirements, document the goals and the scope of the proof of concept, list required applications, publish a manifest to call for EUOS support by governments, add EUOS branding to the system, and more. All of this is necessary work, but it makes me think that this project is well within the concept phase of where it's not even sure what it wants to be or how. There's nothing concrete right now about this. And again, this is a one-man unofficial project, and none of this is backed by any EU institution. I might be wrong, but to the best of my understanding, right now EUOS is an idea of one person, and I don't understand why we are talking about it. Or I think I do actually. It's not about the project itself, rather EUOS is an excuse to discuss an abstract concept that does not yet exist, but that applies to the current times. The idea of an EU independent operating system. I think this is why everybody seems so interested in the sovereignty part of EUOS, even though the large-scale public sector distribution is the key part. Right now we want to discuss EU sovereignty. We need to discuss EU sovereignty, and to do so we've taken what would have otherwise be a negligible topic, I think, and all started talking about it. Robert, by the way, feel free to reach out and tell me that I'm wrong about this and that EUOS is actually much more important than I think. I'm really ready to admit that I might be missing something here. Nonetheless, let's try to go further. What is the European Union doing to embrace open source and digital sovereignty? This video is long already, but let's try to provide a rough overview. We can do so thanks to a petition that has been presented to the European Commission. This petition asked the EU to develop and implement a Linux-based operating system called EU Linux across public administrations in all EU member states. Again, benefits are listed: independence from Microsoft, compliance with GDPR, transparency, and so on. Before you get excited, the response by the Commission is, well, there is currently no formal project to establish a EU Linux. Understandably so. These are not the type of things that are achieved through a Commission petition. They're more similar to information requests. Nonetheless, the response also highlights all of the current efforts by the EU in regards to open source software in the public administration. Firstly, legislation. I covered many of them, such as the Digital Markets Act, but more recently we've seen the Interoperable Europe Act to foster seamless cooperation between digital systems, prioritizing the use of open source and open standards. There are also programs such as the Digital Europe program, CEF Telecom, and ISA2 interoperability programs, I managed to say it, to support the EU digital transformation through open source solutions. Horizon Europe also funds a wide range of projects that involve development and use of open source software and hardware, with its next generation internet having invested more than 140 million euros in over 1,000 community-led open source projects. There's also a body called the Open Source Observatory, who has been tracking news, reports, and case studies demonstrating the growing adoption of open source across the EU. This includes a recent national government's efforts to develop and implement open source alternative to proprietary Office collaboration suites, closely aligned with the petitioner's intentions. The Commission also uses open source software internally. As an example, the majority of their websites are built with Drupal, and they mostly use Linux in data centers. There's also a community open source strategy which encourages the use of open source within the organizations, promotes collaboration through code.europa.eu, and paves the way for more sustainable and transparent digital infrastructures. The Commission organizes bug bounties and hackathons on open source solutions that are of interest, such as Nextcloud, and supports open source adoptions in critical areas. Now, all of this is still miles away from Linux being the standard operating system in the government section, and honestly, Linux itself needs to improve for corporate usage before we get there. And this is why I absolutely embrace projects such as EUOS, don't get me wrong. However, I feel like this round of news got a bit too excited and misunderstood the current goal and size of the project. Which is why I did a video that is 20 minutes long about it. Because I'm smart.